Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Gerard Butler takes command of his hunter-killer submarine to save the Russian president.
When a US and a Russian submarine are both sunk in the Kola Peninsula, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Donegan, played by Gary Oldman, and Rear Admiral Fisk, played by Common, send a hunter-killer submarine to investigate. The sub, commanded by the inexperienced Captain Joe Glass, played by Gerard Butler, soon stumbles upon evidence of a coup by the Russian Defense Minister Dmitry Durov, played by Michael Gore, to overthrow Russian President Sakharine, played by Alexander Dyachenko. Now Glass, with the aid of a Black Ops team led by Toby Stevens' Bill Beeman, must rescue Sakharine and avert a war.
Hunter Killer is, somewhat surprisingly, based off of a book, 2012's Firing Point, which is co-written by George Wallace, who is a retired US naval commander that has served on submarines for 22 years. So if that isn't someone clearly writing from experience, I don't know what is. Maybe that explains why Gerard Butler had a frankly bewildering press conference at the Pentagon to promote this movie. As I understand it, the film is a fairly faithful adaptation of the book, which is understandable because one of the reviews that I saw for it claimed that it read like a Hollywood blockbuster, and obviously the sort of Tom Clancy-esque source material was a natural fit for an adaptation. The film comes to us from our friends at Millennium, the modern day equivalent to Canon Films. They started out making direct-to-video action movies, and they tried to go more legitimate with bigger budgets and bigger names, but even so they've never been able to kind of shake off the cheapness of a lot of their movies. They still seem like bigger budgeted direct-to-video fare. You probably know them best for making the Expendables series, but they've actually had a lot of success with Gerard Butler, who is the star of their Fallen series. Olympus Has Fallen, London Has Fallen, and the forthcoming Angel Has Fallen, which I believe they're on production on right now, and they're trying to recapture that with this movie in another starring vehicle. They've also teamed up with Neil H. Moritz of Original Film, who is best known for the Fast and Furious franchise, although it should be mentioned that he's just one of numerous producers on this movie. This is another one of those films that has about 24 executive producer credits on it. So if you think this movie is any more legitimate than their usual films, those ideas will be quickly sunk by the actual movie itself. That Hunter Killer is bad is not altogether unsurprising, but the way so definitely is. This is a weirdly misshapen glob of a film that's obviously been sat on a shelf for a little bit. They clearly filmed this at least 2 years ago, and I know this with absolute certainty because one of the main actors in it has been dead for 18 months. Poor Michael Nyqvist makes one of his final screen appearances here, playing a Russian captain that Butler's character rescues and plays a pivotal role in the film's plot. And it does have to be said that he looks rather ill in this movie. The film is dedicated to his memory, but even without his presence in it, you could obviously tell this was made for a very different political moment than the one we're in right now, from little details like the fact that the president in it is a woman, played by Caroline Goodall, to the fact that the story itself of the US submarine going out to rescue the Russian president from a coup and throwing the proverbial olive branch between the US and Russia, Butler actually sits down with the aforementioned captain and says, "You and me, we're not that different, you and I." It doesn't really play very well at our current moment, to the point where it could almost be perceived as being completely tone deaf. And so, for a movie that is ostensibly meant to be so accurate about the sort of military and naval world that it portrays, it feels remarkably out of step with our present moment. It makes the movie feel dated right from the very outset. And normally that by itself would be enough to completely write a movie like this off, but Hunter Killer has much bigger problems than that, and much more unusual ones, quite frankly, because from a narrative and structure point of view, this is one of the most baffling I've come across in recent memory. It's not just one bad action movie, it's basically two. It's like if you took two direct-to-video action movies that had very similar plots and spliced them together in some sort of supercut. That's exactly what Hunter Killer feels like when watching it, ostensibly, because it has two parallel storylines with three different sets of cast that almost never interact with each other over the course of it. You have Butler, who spends most of the film on his submarine away from much of the action. You have Gary Oldman, who is in his plotline trying to link things together, and then you have Toby Stephens doing the actual rescue of the Russian president, and each of them seem like their own individual movie, and there's only like a couple of moments where they actually share interactions. Butler and Oldman never share the same space. The closest they get is a phone call very late into the proceedings, and Stephens and Butler only share the briefest of moments on screen together. Otherwise, they're basically going off and doing their own individual thing. It's like competing movies going up against each other. And so that's a very weird experience. It never gels into a cohesive narrative. It always feels like they're completely separate from one another. So let's break down each of these individual components. We'll start with what was ostensibly meant to be the main storyline, Gerard Butler on his submarine. Now, I like a good submarine thriller. You think of classics like The Hunt for the Red October, Crimson Tide, or more recently, Black Sea, all of which profited hugely from that setting, the isolation of being trapped in a tube underwater under heavy pressure. There's a natural tension that comes from that environment. To Hunter Killer's credit, it does seem like they've researched it quite extensively. They used actual plans to replicate for their set, so it does look very authentic on screen a lot of the time. However, it's crucially lacking the suspense that you'd normally associate with this kind of movie, and it comes from multiple directions. The thing is, the structure of the movie completely goes against it, because a lot of those submarine thrillers, once they dive underwater, they're completely cut off. That's exactly the point. That's why the tension is rising, because they have no way of knowing what's happening on the surface. You compare this to something like Crimson Tide, which also dealt with tensions with Russia, and in that movie, you got a lot more sense of impending war and uncertainty. In this movie, they're constantly cutting away to other things, but also, as an audience, we know exactly what's happening in the plot at all times. They clearly explain it to us, and so we're never invested with the feelings of the people on the ship because we know more than them. A lot of the time, what's happening on the submarine isn't really essential to what's happening in the plot. It's only one prong of it. It's never really the driving force of the movie that it really should be. It often feels like a side quest more than anything. And so what is ostensibly meant to be the driving force of the movie actually feels irrelevant a lot of the time. And also, when you go to see a submarine movie, you know that there's going to be a moment where they have to evade the torpedoes, or they get struck by one and it starts leaking. And the movie spends so much time before it actually reaches that point. That's when things are supposed to be getting to a head, and it only comes in the very late stages of the movie. So, in terms of the things that you would expect from a submarine thriller, the film doesn't really deliver on its promises. Speaking of underwhelming, this film very much underutilizes Gerard Butler. The man is an action star. People go to see his movies because of him. Here, he plays the captain of a submarine, so he's barking orders as you would expect. Things like battle stations, right hard rudder, fire the torpedoes. But what you won't see a lot of is him actually in action. In fact, a lot of the time, most of his action in this film is him just being thrown around the set like most of the other actors. And it doesn't feel like he's particularly engaged with the plot of the movie. He actually feels like he's sidelined for a lot of it. A lot of the time, we follow crew members doing duties that he assigns them, or we're cutting away for very long stretches. And so, on that front, as an action movie starring Gerard Butler, this is very, very disappointing. You don't really go to see his movies to see him delivering the dialogue or the plot, which he's perfectly acceptable at doing. He's a fine actor, but, that's not what we want out of a Gerard Butler movie, and I think that people will be very disappointed about that. And I don't think that it helps that the movie is trying to be quite realistic, but really it just comes across as being very, very po-faced and not a lot of fun. And the most enjoyment that I got out of this movie was mostly of the unintentional variety, because there are certain elements of the sort of millennium cheapness that show up that are kind of giggle-inducing, like the fact that the CGI can occasionally border on the cartoonish. There is one sequence fairly early on that is enjoyable because of that. There's a sequence where Butler's sub is fired upon by a Russian sub that's lurking in the ice, and during that sequence where they're trying to evade the torpedoes, the submarine does some really physics-defying moves. You see a submarine in this movie do a, straight 90-degree turn, very sharply, in a way that is totally impossible, quite frankly. That got a laugh out of me. There's also a moment very early on, I think in the opening scene, in fact, the US submarine that gets sunk in the very opening of the film is like a tiny set, and clearly they were trying to decide, well, how do we mark this as an American submarine? You know how you can tell? Because they painted the stars and stripes on the vents above them. That also got a laugh. If Hunter Killer was more like that, if it was more sort of comically bad, I might have enjoyed it a bit more, or if it was a bit more knowing about itself. Instead, it takes itself deadly seriously. This brings me to the second element, where viewers may well be surprised to learn that the actual action in this story takes place away from Butler. This is the Black Ops team headed up by Toby Stephens, who's probably best known as the Bond villain Gustav Graves in Die Another Day. And I'm not exaggerating here, this isn't a subplot, this runs in parallel with Butler's storyline and is just as important, if not maybe more so, because they're the ones that witness the coup, they're the ones that have to rescue the Russian president. So much of the actual plot happens in these scenes with these characters, although that is a little bit of a stretch because characterization is virtually non-existent. I could hardly tell any of these guys apart except for maybe Stephens, and even then, one of them drops the old chestnut of, oh, I've got a girlfriend to go back to when I get home. I'm not sure if he survived at the end of the movie. That's how little I could actually tell these guys apart. They have no distinctive features whatsoever in terms of their personality, and even things like the plot itself is very underdeveloped here. Normally these kind of movies have a mention that, oh, the president is doing some radical policy to justify what happens in the story. They don't even do that here. Just suddenly one day the defense minister decides to just commit treason, just because. I guess today's the day. So much of the actual story takes place away from the start of the movie, and this element has been downplayed in the marketing materials for obvious reasons. They're supposed to be selling a Gerard Butler action movie, not one starring C-listers. And it almost gets to a point where you feel like you've been kind of duped somewhat. You came in expecting one thing, and you've got something else decidedly lesser. You don't want to see your action star on the sidelines in what is basically a very prominent guest role, while a bunch of unknowns do most of the heavy lifting. Stephens is not a big name, so there's gotta be a story behind this, surely. It's so very, very odd. Was Butler offered this role first time around and he chose the captain instead? Because it seems like a Gerard Butler part, and Stephens seems to be doing an impression of him. He's got dialogue that sounds like him, even looks like him with the beard. It's very, very peculiar. Was this offered to another action star who turned it down? It was meant to be a two-hander. That would make more sense than the film that we have right now. Or were they simply trying to dress up what is essentially a very sort of low-budget action movie by getting a lot of big names to surround the material? Because that really seems a bit shady in a lot of respects, and it doesn't help that everything about this particular portion of the movie feels generic, generic. Even the action is perfunctory and not especially memorable and very much lacking impact. And I'm surprised, actually, that this is an R-rated movie because it barely even feels like one. It feels like it was shot as a PG-13 movie, but they added a couple of CGI blood squirts here and there. I don't know why I didn't take them out, because otherwise this is an easy PG-13 that could have played to an even wider audience. So that by itself is very, very baffling. But I don't understand what's going on here. Why is so much of this movie with a bunch of actors that essentially the audience doesn't know and doesn't care about? Which brings us to the scenes in America, which are purely expositional and are there to describe the plot for the audience as if they can't see it happening for themselves, usually totally redundant. If you've seen any kind of movies like this, you know exactly the kind of scenes I'm describing, the ones where people stand in front of screens that are obviously going to be composited in later and go, oh my god, this thing happened. I know! I just saw it! In this movie's case, it's most of the big names like Gary Oldman, Common, Linda Cardellini, all there to get their names on the advertising to give the illusion that they have prominent roles in the proceedings. In Oldman's case, his name is above the title. Like, he's barely in this movie for 10 minutes. I gotta imagine that he's really embarrassed that this is the first role that comes out after he won his Oscar, because he spends much of this as a blustering chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he spends a lot of this role overcompensating for what is an obvious paycheck by yelling all his lines like this. Like, calm down, Gary. We know you're still phoning it in, but you were worried, apparently, that people weren't thinking you were acting if you didn't yell all your lines! I've got to imagine that Oldman's presence in this movie is purely to fulfill a multi-film contract at Millennium, because he previously appeared in Criminal and in that very small villain role in The Hitman's Bodyguard, both Millennium productions, and he's just trying to burn out in a very tiny, tiny role. Believe me, he does not play a key role in the proceedings. This is very, very embarrassing just to see a lot of actors just spout out the most bland exposition you can imagine. I can't imagine a lot of people will be very satisfied by Hunter Killer, which is basically a C-grade actioner disguised with a lot of big names doing very little to try and lure people in. Even by the standard of Gerard Butler action movies, this has to be among one of the very worst of them, because at least in those, he does the things that you came here to see him do. Here, he could almost be described as a peripheral character, so it fails on that count, and elsewhere it feels totally irrelevant and out of date from its very first scenes. And so it's basically a long, tedious, 2-hour bore that feels like a direct-to-video production that somehow managed to pretend it was a theatrical release. And quite frankly, it will deservedly and very quickly sink without trace.
Hunter Killer manages to be not one but two bad action movies all at once. The film is ostensibly meant to be a submarine thriller with Gerard Butler, but the action star is given very little to do other than bark orders, which is not what audiences go to see his films for, and the tension these kind of stories usually have is desperately lacking here, not aided by some cartoonish, physics-defying CGI work. In actuality, most of the action is left to Toby Stephens, who seems to be in a direct-to-video Behind Enemy Lines sequel because they couldn't get a bigger name for the part, in a way that almost feels like a bait and switch to the audience. Elsewhere, Gary Oldman shouts in his tiny top-billed role alongside Common and Linda Cardellini in exposition scenes that tie together three barely connected casts for a story that feels wildly out of step with the current political moment. At a tedious 2 hours, Hunter Killer is very unsatisfying viewing on all fronts.
If you like this review, then you can dive into the depths of my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.